Mummy portraits, or Fayum mummy portraits, is the modern term given to a type of naturalistic painted portraits on wooden boards attached to mummies, from the Coptic period. They belong to the tradition of panel painting, one of the most highly regarded forms of art in the classical world. In fact, the Fayum portraits are the only large body of art from that tradition to have survived. Mummy portraits have been found across Egypt, but are most common in the Fayum basin, particularly from Hawara and Antinopolis. Hence the common name. Fayum portraits is generally thought of as a stylistic, rather than a geographic, description, while painted cartonnage mummy cases date back to pharaonic times. The Fayum mummy portraits were an innovation dating to the Coptic period on time of the Roman occupation of Egypt. They date to the Roman period, from the late 1st century BCE or the early 1st century CE onwards. It is not clear when the production ended, but recent research suggests the middle of the 3rd century. They are among the largest groups among the very few survivors of the highly prestigious panel painting tradition of the classical world, which was continued into Byzantine and Western traditions in the post-classical world, including the local tradition of Coptic iconography in Egypt. The portraits covered the faces of bodies that were mummified for burial. Extant examples indicate that they were mounted into the bands of cloth that were used to wrap the bodies. Almost all have now been detached from the mummies. They usually depict a single person, showing the head, or head and upper chest, viewed frontally. In terms of artistic tradition, the images clearly derive more from Greco-Roman traditions than Egyptian ones. Two groups of portraits can be distinguished by technique, one of encaustic paintings, the other in tempera. The former are usually of higher quality. About 900 mummy portraits are known at present. The majority were found in the necropolis of Fayum. Due to the hot, dry Egyptian climate, the paintings are frequently very well preserved, often retaining their brilliant colors seemingly unfaded by time. History of research. Pre-19th century, the Italian explorer Piero della Valle, on a visit to Saqqara, Memphis in 1615, was the first European to discover and describe mummy portraits. He transported some mummies with portraits to Europe, which are now in the Albertinum. 19th century collectors, although interest in ancient Egypt steadily increased after that period. Further finds of mummy portraits did not become known before the early 19th century. The provenance of these first new finds is unclear. They may come from Saqqara as well, or perhaps from Thebes. In 1820, the Baron of Minutuli acquired several mummy portraits for a German collector, but they became part of a whole shipload of Egyptian artifacts lost in the North Sea. In 1827, Elia Couto and Laborde brought two portraits, supposedly found in Memphis, to Europe, one of which can today be seen at the Louvre, the other in the British Museum. Ippolito Rossellini, a member of Jean-François Champollion's 1828-29 expedition to Egypt, brought a further portrait back to Florence. It is so similar to de Laborde's specimens that it thought to be from the same source. During the 1820s, the British Consul General to Egypt, Henry Salt, sent several further portraits to Paris and London. Some of them were long considered portraits of the family of the Theban archon Polios Sota, a historical character known from written sources. But this has turned out to be incorrect. Once again, a long period elapsed before more mummy portraits came to light. In 1887, Daniel Marie Fouquet heard of the discovery of numerous portrait mummies in a cave. He set off to inspect them some days later, but arrived too late, as the finders had used the painted plaques for firewood during the 3 previous cold desert nights. Fouquet acquired the remaining 2 of what had originally been 50 portraits. While the exact location of this find is unclear, the likely source is from Urubaya. At that location, not long after Fouquet's visit, the Viennese art trader Theodore Graf found several further images. which he tried to sell as profitably as possible. He engaged the famous Leipzig-based Egyptologist Georgi Baz to publish his finds. He produced presentation folders to advertise his individual finds throughout Europe. Although little was known about their archaeological find contexts, Graf went as far as to ascribe the portraits to known Ptolemaic pharaohs by analogy with other works of art, mainly coin portraits. None of these associations were particularly well argued or convincing, but they gained him much attention, not least because he gained the support of well-known scholars like Rudolf Virchow. As a result, mummy portraits became the center of much attention. By the late 19th century, their very specific aesthetic made same sought-after collection pieces, distributed by the global arts trade. Archaeological study. Flinders Petrie. In parallel, more scientific engagement with the portraits was beginning. In 1887, the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie started excavations at Huara. He discovered a Roman necropolis which yielded 81 portrait mummies in the first year of excavation. At an exhibition in London, these portraits drew large crowds. In the following year, Petrie continued excavations at the same location, but now suffered from the competition of a German and an Egyptian art dealer. Petrie returned in the winter of 1910-11 and excavated a further 70 portrait mummies, some of them quite badly preserved, with very few exceptions. Petrie's studies still provide the only examples of mummy portraits so far found as the result of systematic excavation and published properly. Although the published studies are not entirely up to modern standards, they remain the most important source for the find contexts of portrait mummies. Late 19th and early 20th century collectors. In 1892, the German archaeologist von Kaufmann discovered the so-called Tomb of Aileen, which held 3 mummy portraits, among the most famous today. Other important sources of such finds are at Antinopolis and Akhmim. The French archaeologist Albert Gayet worked at Antinopolis and found much relevant material, but his work, like that of many of his contemporaries, does not satisfy modern standards. His documentation is incomplete. Many of his finds remain without context. Museums today, mummy portraits are represented in all important archaeological museums of the world. Many museums around the world have fine examples of Fayum mummy portraits on display, notably the British Museum, the Royal Museum of Scotland, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Louvre in Paris. Because they were mostly recovered through inappropriate and unprofessional means, virtually all are without archaeological context, a fact which consistently lowers the quality of archaeological and culture-historical information they provide. As a result, their overall significance as well as their specific interpretations remain highly controversial. Materials and techniques. The majority images show a formal portrait of a single figure, facing and looking toward the viewer, from an angle that is usually slightly turned from full face. The figures are presented as busts against a monochrome background which in some instances is decorated. The individuals are both male and female and range in age from childhood to old age. Painted surface. The majority of preserved mummy portraits were painted on boards or panels, made from different imported hardwoods, including oak, lime, sycamore, cedar, cypress, fig, and citrus. The wood was cut into thin rectangular panels and made smooth. The finished panels were set into layers of wrapping that enclosed the body, and were surrounded by bands of cloth, giving the effect of a window-like opening through which the face of the deceased could be seen. Portraits were sometimes painted directly onto the canvas or rags of the mummy wrapping. Painting techniques. The wooden surface was sometimes primed for painting with a layer of plaster. In some cases the primed layer reveals a preparatory drawing. 2 painting techniques were employed: encaustic painting and egg-based tempera. The encaustic images are striking because of the contrast between vivid and rich colors, and comparatively large brushstrokes, producing an impressionistic effect. The tempera paintings have a finer gradation of tones and chalkier colors, giving a more restrained appearance. In some cases, gold leaf was used to depict jewelry and wreaths. There are also examples of hybrid techniques or of variations from the main techniques. The Fayum portraits reveal a wide range of painterly expertise and skill in presenting a lifelike appearance. The naturalism of the portraits is often revealed in knowledge of anatomic structure and in skilled modeling of the form by the use of light and shade, which gives an appearance of three-dimensionality to most of the figures. The graded flesh tones are enhanced with shadows and highlights indicative of directional lighting. Subjects and social context of the paintings. People of Fayum under Greco-Roman rule. Egypt hosted several Greek settlements, mostly concentrated in Alexandria, but also in a few other cities, where Greek settlers lived alongside some 7 to 10 million native Egyptians. Fayum's earliest Greek inhabitants were soldier veterans and clerics who were settled by the Ptolemaic kings on reclaimed lands. Native Egyptians also came to settle in Fayum from all over the country, notably the Nile Delta, Upper Egypt, Oxyrhynchus and Memphis, to undertake the labor involved in the land reclamation process, as attested by personal names, local cults and recovered papyri. It is estimated that as much as 30% of the population of Fayum was Greek during the Ptolemaic period, with the rest being native Egyptians. By the Roman period, much of the Greek population of Fayum was made up of either Hellenized Egyptians or people of mixed Egyptian-Greek origins. While commonly believed to represent Greek settlers in Egypt, the Fayum portraits instead reflect the complex synthesis of the predominant Egyptian culture and that of the elite Greek minority in the city. According to Walker, the early Ptolemaic Greek colonists married local women and adopted Egyptian religious beliefs, and by Roman times, their descendants were viewed as Egyptians by the Roman rulers, despite their own self-perception of being Greek. The dental morphology of the Roman period Fayum mummies was also compared with that of earlier Egyptian populations, and was found to be much more closely akin to that of ancient Egyptians than to Greeks or other European populations. Age profile of those depicted. Most of the portraits depict the deceased at a relatively young age, and many show children. According to Walker, CAT, scans of all the complete mummies represented in Walker reveal a correspondence of age and, in suitable cases, sex between mummy and image. Walker concludes that the age distribution reflects the low life expectancy at the time. It was often believed that the wax portraits were completed during the life of the individual and displayed in their home, a custom that belonged to the traditions of Greek art, but this view is no longer widely held given the evidence suggested by the CAT scans of the Fayum mummies, as well as Roman census returns. In addition, some portraits were painted directly onto the coffin, for example, on a shroud or another part. Social status. The patrons of the portraits apparently belonged to the affluent upper class of military personnel, civil servants, and religious dignitaries. Not everyone could afford a mummy portrait. Many mummies were found without one. Flinders Petrie states that only 1 or 2% of the mummies he excavated were embellished with portraits. The rates for mummy portraits do not survive, but it can be assumed that the material caused higher costs than the labor, since in antiquity, painters were appreciated as craftsmen rather than as artists. The situation from the tomb of Aileen is interesting in this regard. It contained 4 mummies, those of Aileen, of 2 children and of her husband. Unlike his wife and children, the latter was not equipped with a portrait but with a gilt 3-dimensional mask. Perhaps plaster masks were preferred if they could be afforded. It is not clear whether those depicted are of Egyptian, Greek or Roman origin, nor whether the portraits were commonly used by all ethnicities. The name of some of those portrayed are known from inscriptions. They are of Egyptian, Greek and Roman origin. Hairstyles and clothing are always influenced by Roman fashion. Women and children are often depicted wearing valuable ornaments and fine garments, men often wearing specific and elaborate outfits. Greek inscriptions of names are relatively common, sometimes they include professions. It is not known whether such inscriptions always reflect reality, or whether they may state ideal conditions or aspirations rather than true conditions. One single inscription is known to definitely indicate the deceased's profession correctly. The mummy of a woman named Hermione also included the term grammatica. For a long time, it was assumed that this indicated that she was a teacher by profession, but today, it is assumed that the term indicates her level of education. Some portraits of men show sword belts or even pommels, suggesting that they were members of the Roman military. Culture. Historical context. Changes in burial habits. The burial habits of Ptolemaic Egyptians mostly followed ancient traditions. The bodies of members of the upper classes were mummified, equipped with a decorated coffin and a mummy mask to cover the head. The Greeks who entered Egypt at that time mostly followed their own habits. There is evidence from Alexandria and other sites indicating that they practiced the Greek tradition of cremation. This broadly reflects the general situation in Hellenistic Egypt, its rulers proclaiming themselves to be pharaohs but otherwise living in an entirely Hellenistic world, incorporating only very few local elements. Conversely, the Egyptians only slowly developed an interest in the Greek Hellenic culture that dominated the East Mediterranean since the conquest of Alexander. This situation changed substantially with the arrival of the Romans. Within a few generations, all Egyptian elements disappeared from everyday life. Cities like Karanis or Oxyrhynchus are largely Greco-Roman places. There is clear evidence that this resulted from a mixing of different ethnicities in the ruling classes of Roman Egypt. Religious continuity. Only in the sphere of religion is there evidence for a continuation of Egyptian traditions. Egyptian temples were erected as late as the 2nd century. In terms of burial habits, Egyptian and Hellenistic elements now mixed. Coffins became increasingly unpopular and went entirely out of use by the 2nd century. In contrast, mummification appears to have been practiced by large parts of the population. The mummy mask, originally an Egyptian concept, grew more and more Greco-Roman in style. Egyptian motifs became ever rarer. The adoption of Roman portrait painting into Egyptian burial cult belongs into this general context. Link with Roman funeral masks. Some authors suggest that the idea of such portraits may be related to the custom among the Roman nobility of displaying images of their ancestors in the atrium of their house. In funeral processions, these wax masks were worn by professional mourners to emphasize the continuity of an illustrious family line, but originally perhaps to represent a deeper evocation of the presence of the dead. Roman festivals such as the Parentalia as well as everyday domestic rituals cultivated ancestral spirits. The development of mummy portraiture may represent a combination of Egyptian and Roman funerary tradition, since it appears only after Egypt was established as a Roman province. Salon paintings. The images depict the heads or busts of men, women and children. They probably date from c. 30 BC to the 3rd century. To the modern eye, the portraits appear highly individualistic. Therefore, it has been assumed for a long time that they were produced during the lifetime of their subjects and displayed as salon paintings within their houses, to be added to their mummy wrapping after their death. Newer research rather suggests that they were only painted after death, an idea perhaps contradicted by the multiple paintings on some specimens and the change of specific details on others. The individualism of those depicted was actually created by variations in some specific details, within a largely unvaried general scheme. The habit of depicting the deceased was not a new one, but the painted images gradually replaced the earlier Egyptian masks. Although the latter continued in use for some time, often occurring directly adjacent to portrait mummies, sometimes even in the same graves. Realism and convention, together with the painted Etruscan tombs, the Lucanian tombs and the tomb of the diver in Paestum, the frescoes from Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the Greek vases. They are the best preserved paintings from ancient times and are renowned for their remarkable naturalism. It is, however, debatable whether the portraits depict the subjects as they really were. Analyses have shown that the painters depicted faces according to conventions in a repetitive and formulaic way, albeit with a variety of hairstyles and beards. They appear to have worked from a number of standard types without making detailed observations of the unique facial proportions of specific individuals, which give each face its own personality. Style in the virtual absence of other panel paintings from the period in question. It is difficult to make firm statements about the stylistic context of the portraits. While it seems clear that they are not in continuity from Egyptian precedents, the same cannot be said for the northern shores of the Mediterranean, where such material is less likely to have survived due to climatic conditions there. Evidence from frescoes, mosaics and other media suggests that stylistically, the mummy portraits broadly fit within the prevailing Greco-Roman traditions then dominant around the Mediterranean. Coexistence with other burial habits. The religious meaning of mummy portraits has not, so far, been fully explained, nor have associated grave rites. There is some indication that it developed from genuine Egyptian funerary rites, adapted by a multicultural ruling class. The tradition of mummy portraits occurred from the Delta to Nubia, but it is striking that other funerary habits prevailed over portrait mummies at all sites except those in the Fayum and Antinopolis. In most sites, different forms of burial coexisted. The choice of grave type may have been determined to a large extent by the financial means and status of the deceased, modified by local customs. Portrait mummies have been found both in rock-cut tombs and in freestanding built grave complexes, but also in shallow pits. It is striking that they are virtually never accompanied by any grave offerings, with the exception of occasional pots or sprays of flowers.